Hi there, this is Michael Becker, and welcome to the Identity Nexus. This is a podcast where we delve into all things personal data and identity and the intersection of that into business and marketing. And with me today is Wendy Poe. She is a graduating senior at Miami University of Ohio, and she is an expert in accessibility design. And so we're going to be talking about what actually is accessibility design and how that works. So Wendy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And so first and foremost, can you give us a little bit of background on like, who are you? What are you doing? And like, maybe what do you think your superpower is?
That's a great question. So I'm graduating with 2 degrees next month in May. So I'll have a bachelor's of science in speech pathology, and I'll have a bachelor's of arts in interactive media design. And so I combine these 2 fields pretty often across my coursework to make this field called accessible design. And what's
your superpower?
And my superpower is I bring like peace to a space. People calm down when I walk into a room. I can calm down like large groups of children all at once at summer camps. I get like brought in to do things like that for other people. So I think that's my superpower.
That's a wickedly cool superpower. I like that. So when we're looking at an industry, we see a lot of things. We see UX, we see CX, we see a whole bunch of things we call design. And then we're adding onto this new term, accessibility. So can we start with, you're defining some of these core terms, like what is design? What is user UX? What is CX? And then what is accessibility?
Yeah, so for design, I would say that's like creating a thing with intention. And then making it one step further, user experience is designing that thing to be used by someone. So the way I've explained it to people outside of the design field is like, you're not just building a coffee shop and making a menu. You're deciding what handles go on the door so that it's easy to open. You're designing the flow into the space so people can walk in and feel comfortable. You have to choose the height of the counter so that people can reach their coffee. So you're designing the experience that someone has, and along those ways, you're making things to make that happen. But the experience is the overall feelings and steps that person has to take to make that experience.
Very cool. Is CX, customer experience, and user experience different? UX, CX?
So in my curriculum at school, we haven't really gone into the difference between CX and UX. They get used interchangeably a lot.
Okay.
So I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And as I've played around with it sometimes, I really loved your idea of the overall experience. And I think where UX tends to be used is more on the the interface of things, like a website design or a mobile app. So that's the UX, like where do the pixels go, where do the images go? But I actually, which is really important. But to your point, the overall customer experience aspect of design is absolutely critical. And then you started to allude to it, I think, like the height of the counter in the coffee shop. Does that start getting us towards more concepts of accessibility and the importance of that?
Yeah, it does. So the height of the counter thing, that's a video I had to watch that it was really eye-opening. It was about a woman with dwarfism encountering the world and she lives in a place where everything has been made ADA compliant, which is Americans with Disability Act compliant. And a lot of that is focused towards like people with mobility devices, wheelchairs, things like that, which means a lot of things get raised. Like toilet seats get raised, counters get raised, or door handles become like push panels instead of handles. So if things are like handles, then she can reach like the bottom of the handle instead of the top of the handle. Where she might not have enough force to push through a push panel. And the height of the counter for this coffee shop she went to, it was too tall for her to reach, and if she reached over her head, she was afraid to like accidentally pour hot coffee onto her head.
Okay.
So that, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And so how, and when you're going through this process, and so let's summarize then before we move on to kind of some more topics and more specific tactics. How would you summarize like a concrete definition of accessibility design?
So I define it as meeting the needs of the people you're serving at any ability level that you're going to be serving.
Okay.
So
Okay, go ahead, please.
so like including lots of perspectives of people who are differently able than you.
Okay.
Is how I would go about making a product accessible.
And where would one start with that? So, when you and I were, doing some preamble discussions, there's things for people to consider like interface design, print design, physical design, and this accessibility comment construct. I actually was quite pleased. The first example you used was a coffee shop, as opposed to, I'm so digitally oriented lately. When I think design, I immediately go to like app and website. So we're now living in this digital world. So when we're doing accessible design, we need to be thinking both physical environments as well as digital environments for those that we're serving, correct? Or
Right.
And you refer to it as being the differently abled people we serve.
Right. Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit about, if I'm an executive, if I'm someone in the design group, if I'm a marketer, for example, where would I go research about understanding the people I serve and helping me get a sense of like the needs of the different types of people that I serve? What other approaches can we use to help us understand like the people that we serve?
Yeah. So we've done Miami. I've done surveys out to people, and I don't ask because people don't have to disclose what their condition specifically might be, but you can ask, do you get tired easy?
Oh, okay.
Because that fatigue is a symptom of a lot of conditions.
Okay.
And reframing questions. So if you're like building an app and you ask, do you get tired easy? That might make you shorten your workload or add more white space to a landing page so that it's not visually exhausting to work through the app.
Okay.
Yeah.
And okay, fantastic. And is there a resource that you can think of? And maybe we can put it on later in the comments of the webinar, like resources that you can share with us where people can learn about, producing surveys like that can help them do that. But also too, how, when we think about, the nature of society and the industry, we tend to build to, an average or a norm, but there's a broad spectrum of people. So where can we go, or where could someone go to learn about, how the accessibility market, or the differently abled market, what percentage of different people wear, what conditions do people have? I mean, I'm kind of butchering the language here. I'm not exactly even sure how to, appropriately ask the question, but I think you understand what I'm trying to get at. So
Yeah.
how can we learn more about this market and really educate ourselves?
Yeah. So I have some TED Talks that I sent to you in that document. One of them that I like a lot is When We Design for Disability, We All Benefit, and that's a TED Talk. And even if you just choose one disability, so like for example, there's a like vegetable peeler that was made for peeling potatoes and stuff that has these side grips on it that changed the way all vegetable peelers were made, and it was made for this man's wife who had arthritis.
Oh, okay.
And
So in
yeah.
some respects, just serving one. So one of the key insights we're having here is just serving one particular audience can end up serving many, with
Yes.
one solution. That makes me think of an example I heard one time where I think it was Dove. It was a shampoo manufacturer. I'll drop it in the comments later. But they also were reconfiguring their bottles for shampoo, and they were putting different dots on it, and configuring the physical feel of the bottle for the blind, because the blind person would have a difficulty distinguishing, say, shampoo versus conditioner. But to your point, and actually that just really hit home for me, was because they did that, well, when else are you also potentially blind? Well, when you're sitting in your shower and you can't see, right? And you want to just lean over and grab a bottle. So that really helped everybody.
Exactly.
You know, regardless of whether or not I actually have an eyesight disability or not. So
Right.
that was pretty exciting to see. The other one that comes to mind is there was a famous, you know, and just talking about the life or death importance of usability and accessibility in design, was a story in World War II where, I don't know if you've heard of this one. Bomber pilots were coming back from the war, and right at the point of landing, they were crashing and dying, and they could not figure out why. And it turned out because they designed the cockpit where they put the flaps right next to the landing gear. And so as they were coming in, the pilot was tired and pulling the wrong lever, and that was basically stalling the plane and killing the crew. And so what they learned from that experience was that they needed to move that lever and actually physically change its design, so that they could do it in the dark. You know, they could do it when they're tired. And so I think, you know, again, these, you know, maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about the importance of, you know, because you brought up ADH compliance, and one could say, well, you've got to be doing these design things because it's regulatorily required, or it's commercially viable because you can be treating your customers. But can you talk a little bit more about the benefits of focusing on accessibility?
Yeah. So when you focus on accessibility, you're making things easier for everyone. And another example is zoos is mostly all ramps, all sidewalks, because a lot of people come with strollers.
Okay.
Um, well, it also, just because even if you don't have a wheelchair, just because you're walking around, you get tired. You're walking around a zoo, it's a couple miles. Um, and having the whole place accessible to strollers made it also accessible to people who walk and get tired, like grandparents, to people who use walkers. It's easier for the employees to like push carts around and things like that. So there's that, and then there's also like, trying to remember, there was an example where there was these like goggles that were safety goggles for someone who was deaf. And so they couldn't hear behind them, and so they put reflectors on the sides of these safety goggles because this woman was working in conditions where it was very important to know if there was something flying behind you.
Yes.
And that became like an industry standard for her industry, was to wear goggles that had these reflectors, because it's a noise. I can't remember exactly what she worked on, but she was in a noisy environment where even if people weren't deaf, you couldn't always hear if there was something dangerous happening behind you.
Yes.
And if you're required to wear safety goggles for 8 hours a day, you should probably know what's going on behind you if you're in that kind of working environment. And so like a small step for one person could also be a small step for everybody else.
That's a really critical insight. So when we think about then, and I'm kind of looking at some of the notes you were thinking about for our conversation today, you know, so digital interfaces. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of, you know, how we apply accessibility best practices in digital interfaces?
Yeah. Let me go back up to here for digital interfaces. So one of the main things is making your digital interface perceivable by lots of people. Like, can they interact physically, see that, hear that, feel that interface?
Let me pause you right there too. When we're talking about interfaces, am I talking about my
Yeah.
phone? Am I talking about my computer? Am I talking about a digital display at a store? I mean, what do we mean by digital interfaces? Maybe we can start with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I am most familiar with website design and a little bit familiar with app design. So when I'm thinking about it, that's what I think about. It could also be applied to like screens at stores, or I'm not sure. I don't think it would be applicable to things like TVs where there's like a lot going on with that.
Okay.
But yeah, I would like websites and app design is what I'm most familiar with in this context.
Perfect.
Yeah. So one thing is if your product is only perceivable by one sense, like you can only see it, or you can only like get auditory feedback from clicking a button, you don't know if you clicked that button if you can't see it or can't hear it. then you're making the product very ambiguous to a person using it. And the point of good design is to make everything very easily understandable. And if they can't understand it, they may not be able to use your design, and they would give up on your product and move on to something else.
Correct.
So I would recommend having like if you're on your phone, having like the button's been pressed, it vibrates a little bit. So if they can't see it, they can feel it, or if they can't hear it, they can feel it. And that could be a setting that people turn on. Like, it doesn't have to be a standard. Another thing is really important for digital interfaces. If they can change the settings themselves, that empowers the user, and makes it more adaptable for what they specifically need to get out of that experience.
Yeah.
So having a setting that says I can turn this on and buttons will vibrate, or I can make the colors extra high contrast or something like that. That's really cool to have. If I have sensory issues one day, like everybody has sensory issues at some point. If I'm feeling overwhelmed one day and there's a setting on an app or a website that says I can turn all brightness down, that makes me like really excited. I'm like, oh, great, someone thought about me.
Yeah.
I can still use this today. So having settings like that's really important.
Okay. And so beyond buttons and settings, you talked about color contrast. What do we mean in terms of just simple like text layouts, and you call it coding? I mean, what are some of the other considerations that we need to be considering?
Yeah, so for coding, it's like common to have alt text for images, but it's also important to have the proper H1, H2s, T1, T2s, those like headers and titles that you need to put in per program to program a site. That's how a screen reader will read something off a page, and a screen reader is used when someone either can't read that site themselves, like they're blind, or they have MS and they get fatigued easily from visual constraints, or they have a traumatic brain injury and they need something to read off of them. If you make it more confusing for them, they're already in a place where they need that assistance to be able to have the same access that you or I could have. If you make it more confusing for them, it sounds like chaos. That's not what we want. We want them to be able to use your site.
Right.
This is a problem I see with a lot of like restaurant menus, is websites for restaurants will just upload pictures or like JPEGs of their menu, and a screen reader will just read that as like menu.jpg, and you won't know, and you wouldn't be able to order from there, so you probably wouldn't use that restaurant. You'd go somewhere else.
I see. And in your experience, does it add a lot of extra cost to do it right? Is it just more of being awareness of that these are the things to consider? So for example, if I'm building out a website, is there a lot of extra cost to add these capabilities in, or is it just being awareness that you should be aware of doing this when you're building the site?
It's actually it's most cost effective if you design with accessibility first, rather than design something and then do a redesign to make it more accessible.
Okay.
Which is it's not rocket science. If you design it well the first time, every iteration just has to be small.
Right. And so like I was not aware of the T1 or T2 tag before.
Yeah.
I'd always heard of H1's H2 HTML tags, but and very similar, T1, T2, very similar. It just calls out this is a title of something.
Yeah. This is for like children's books. Something I have to work on for speech path classes is I had to make a children's book. And so there's like, if you're making titles there's a big header that's the title of the book. And then there'd be a title, which is like the author's name.
Okay.
And then H2 would be H1 was title of the book. T1 was author's name. H2 is like, this is the start of the book. And then if there was things throughout the book that needed different sections, each of those sections could have been H1 or an H or a T, but it was just delineating like this is a separate part from the headers.
I see.
Like this is, yeah, like there's nothing going under this. a header is like the start of a section, whereas a title is a separate thing from a header, is how it's been explained to me.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And where would we learn more about those? Presumably maybe W3C schools, like the web
Yeah.
forum, things like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And what else would we think about in terms of, so a lot of it sounds like a lot of the accessibility development or design, there is some visual color schemes, obviously,
Mhm.
buttons, the haptic interaction, and then a lot of it's that metadata behind the scenes, the non-visual
Yeah.
elements of the design that actually help drive a lot of this.
Yeah. Yeah. I also recommend for buttons, not having them too close together, because there's a lot of conditions that cause people to have tremors, especially extremity tremors, so like fingers and hands and wrists. So if you have buttons that are too close together, or their hitboxes overlap or something like that, the collision detection will they'll drag their hand over, or they'll drag their mouse over everywhere. Collision detection will find whatever they don't want and click on it, because they're not trying to shake, but they are shaking. And I've seen this a lot with anything that has a shopping cart e-commerce site, and there's like a plus and a minus with a number in between, and those are so close together, and so someone can accidentally add three like quantities of that product and not want to, and try to go back, try to subtract it, and accidentally add another one because they slid over without trying to.
I see. Okay. And do you think at some point, where is the cutoff between is there are there some universal best practices that we can do that, apply for everyone? And then might there then be a, view this site option that really kind of puts the page accessibility on steroids, if you will, and says really clears it out and moves those things, because not everybody, I don't know the percentage. That wasn't be another question I have for you is, but might there be an option of like generalized accessibility site and a more advanced accessibility settings?
Yeah.
Seen that in the market, and is that a preferred approach as well?
Yeah, I've seen that with the Special Olympics national website. They have their standard website that anybody can use, and there's a big puzzle piece on the right side that says accessibility on it. And if you click that, the whole site shifts a little bit.
Okay.
And I think that would be a really great thing to add to any website. Because there's some websites, like there's like art museums where that website is also art, and it was designed to reflect an art museum's art.
Yes.
Where making it accessible after the fact of being designed in a certain way would contradict the intent of that design. But if you add to an art museum, because if it's a public museum, people are going to come from all different ability levels. If you add that little puzzle piece that says accessibility, and it spreads things out, or it introduces more progressive disclosure into the navigation, so there's fewer things to overwhelm you, something like that, I think that would be a really good solution.
And then it's intentional too, and then people make their own choice, as you were saying earlier. Now, when we think about making our choices and like which thing we which kind of disability we may design for or start with, or do you know where could a business or a leader go find statistics about are there government sites, are there sources that we could get a sense of how much of my audience may be afflicted by one particular I'm struggling for the words there, able design, or what's the right terminology I should be using when referencing this? I don't want to keep saying the word disability, because it's that
right.
So maybe you can educate me and us too on what are the right words.
Yeah, so right now the most acceptable terms, if you're a member of the disability community, and that's D, capital D, disability community, and that's your identity, then you can use disability.
Okay.
If you're discussing a condition that someone has, which is a medical condition or an impairment that is caused by that, then you use the words condition or impairment.
Okay.
And if you're referring to someone and you're not a member of the disability community, or they don't identify as disabled, then you ask them, and a lot of people will tell you, like differently abled is like a very politically correct term to use, but not everybody likes differently abled.
Right.
But like a deaf person who is like capital D deaf
Okay.
will say, I am deaf, it is part of my identity.
Yes.
Whereas someone who is medically has profound hearing loss, they're lowercase d deaf. And they'll say, I have profound hearing loss, but I'm not deaf.
I see. I see.
So if you're referring to someone and you just ask that person, that's the best way to go. But if you're referring to a larger community of people, then you can say differently abled or disability community.
And where would be a good resource to learn about and become more aware of appropriate use of these terms? That's my first question. And my second question is, are you aware of government sites that help us understand like how many people have these different conditions?
I can send you some resources to put with this podcast.
Yeah.
I have resources for language surrounding the disability community, but I don't have statistics.
Okay.
There's a lot of presentations I sit through where they just quote statistics, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, but I don't want to misquote something now.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect answer. And I'd love to find some common resource because, for instance, if I'm a marketing manager and I'm wanting to become more aware and sensitive of this, before I go start reaching out to the people I serve, my customers, my patients, my voters, whomever they may be. Well, you were just telling me I need to be a little bit more sensitive about even the way I ask the question. So one, having some resources would be great. And then two, just to understanding at the end of the day, often these are businesses and we need to evaluate where we put our resources, right? So am I investing in something for 1.5% of the potential people that may be visiting my site, or something that is more generally applicable that could actually serve 30% of those that may be visiting my site? Or if we get lucky, we come up with an idea where it serves a good 5-10%, but that idea actually helps everybody. So that
Exactly. Yeah.
we can get some homework, and have some places where people can go to learn more about this. That would be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I also know of there's some like public interest sites that are government trying to remember where it's like it's public information, the government's released information.
Yeah.
And they're required to have it in a certain number of languages, and it has to be at like a 3rd grade reading level and all these things. And they'll start with like English, Spanish, 3rd grade reading level for each, and they'll have options for both. And then they'll add later if they decide they need more languages, like they've added Mandarin to some sites, or they've added. I'm from DC, and so we have a large immigrant population coming in from Iraq and a few other places that you know how it is.
Yeah.
But there's people coming in all the time from Iraq and Afghanistan, and so some like DC government websites have added languages for those populations because they know they're specifically serving those languages.
Yeah. So context, and also too, good, I guess, great accessible design also considers context.
Yeah.
And what, that moment and that environment, and to the extent that you can be locally contextually relevant is critical.
Yeah, it's just, I feel like it's very similar to branding, whereas like Spotify has an Instagram for Brazil that's different than their Instagram for the US, because they understand cultures are different, language is different, music is listened to, but they're in different contexts.
Yes.
And so they will brand differently for different cultures.
And we've been spending a lot of our discussion right now about the digital side of it, websites, the same insights that you were sharing could also be applicable to applications on, say, mobile phones, but they also apply to print and physical objects as well. We talked a little bit about a store. Maybe you can give us some best practices on print and physical objects too.
Yeah. So for
physical spaces, sorry.
Yeah, so I'll start with some print design things. Is that margins and white space are very important. It's important for general design best practices, but it's also important to give space to things that might be like visually exhausting, and also especially for books and picture books, to have that margin to recognize this is a different thing. I haven't really talked about intellectual disabilities yet, but for people who are cognitively, so it could be a cognitive impairment, which is not necessarily disabling, but it could be an intellectual disability. Either way, their level of understanding is different than someone who doesn't have that. So the white space is a visual way to know that this is a different thing.
Mm.
Whereas some designs have a lot going on together, like overlapping words and pictures. And they look really cool, like band t-shirts look really cool. But can they be understood by everyone? Not really.
Yeah.
And then another thing I talk about that surprises people is when you're considering books, especially for kids, and the language you use around it. It's important to have short phrases and simplified word choices, regardless of your target audience. But especially for kids, I like to consider how hard it would be for them to pronounce the words if they were to read it out loud. Because with my speechcraft background, I learned about language milestones and the order in which children typically develop sounds or phonemes. So R is usually the last phoneme to develop, and that's usually around 7 years old. So if you're going to make a main character for a children's book and your target audience is like 3 or 4-year-olds, and you make the main character start with an R or end with an R, a 3 or 4-year-old wouldn't be able to probably pronounce that word. And so it would be difficult for them to read that book out loud if they wanted to, if they're able to read that. But if you were to make that same book and apply it for a 7-year-old, you could use R and it would be an appropriate challenge for them. So like younger kids, D and B are the first phonemes to develop. So using a lot of D and B words would be more appropriate. And then M and N would follow that. So just being aware of like, can someone produce this word when I'm writing it? It's hard. It's a hard thing to do, and it's a hard thing to remember to think about. But kids will appreciate a book more if they can read that book, you know?
Well, yeah, and we actually in industry too have a similar problem with privacy policies. You know, in that they are written in legalese. So, you know, most people aren't the lawyers, so don't actually understand the terminology that they're reading or the implications of that. The second being is they tend to be written at a 12th grade reading level, when the average reading level I understand is somewhere around 8th grade in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. So that's super problematic. You're basically asking somebody to agree essentially to a contract for the exchanging of personal information about themselves, when we pretty much know they can't read it. You know, and that's something we need to be fixing as an industry, I think.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
Yeah, it's important to be able to read the thing that you're trying to engage with. Read and understand it's 2 steps. Your brain has to go through 2 processes. So if the reading part takes too long or is too difficult, you can't get to the understanding part.
Right. And on that last point, I'm glad you said that too long. I also saw a circa like 2011 stat said, you know, if you were to agree, it would take somewhere like 78, 75 days to read every privacy policy you sign up for. And like, imagine how many we're doing every day. So it literally would take months of your time to read all of the privacy policies if you have to sign up for. That is if you even can read them anyway. And so that's why we just hit, you know, I accept and move on without actually reading them. So there's some really interesting stuff that I would see that would be fun to see people like you dig into and try to address them. The accessibility design to privacy policies, I think, would be an interesting project.
I think so too. Yeah, because I think it's important to know like who has your information, what are they doing with it.
Okay, so on
Um,
print, books and word choice and white space, that's great. And you also
yep.
have objectives for us on like physical objects as well as physical spaces. What are your thoughts on around those areas?
Yeah, so for some physical object things, is asking if this object that you're making, can it be used? Is it planning to be used by all people or specific people? Like if you have an audience, really, really understand that audience and who could use it. Or if it's going to be for all people, is it really going to be able to use by like all sizes of people, all abilities of people, all grip strengths of people, like the potato peeler example or the vegetable peeler example. It was made both because it was hard to grip and grip strength is weaker for people with arthritis. But it helps everybody. If you consider how can I make this easier to hold,
Yeah,
everybody wants something easier to hold.
yeah.
Um, and then I have an example from my senior capstone that I studied abroad in London this past summer. And I had to make a head and neck support for a 4-year-old girl with cerebral palsy. She could not keep her neck up because she had hypotonia in her neck as a result of her cerebral palsy, and hypotonia is lack of muscle tone. So she didn't have the strength to hold her own head up on her neck because her muscles were too floppy. They didn't have the level of contraction that you or I have to just hold our head up. So because of that, she couldn't keep eye contact with people in order to start the communication development process.
Mm.
And at 4 years old, that was pretty concerning. So we made a head and neck support for her that it was like it would spring up so she could lifted her head back, it would spring her back up so she could maintain eye contact. And then we had cushioning around the neck to make it comfortable for her. But there was 2 things that we had to redesign. So we did a first iteration, and then we had to do a redesign that we hadn't considered the first time, which was we had to account for drooling, which is also a symptom of the hypotonia. Her salivary glands also are floppy, and so they'll salivate without her trying. So we had to make these removable sleeves like pillowcases to go onto the neck support so we could slide them on and off whenever they needed to be cleaned. So we didn't have to remove the whole device. So she could still maintain eye contact with someone if she was trying to make intentional communication attempts. She could still do that while we were changing out a sleeve.
Yeah.
And then to account for her seizures, which is also a side effect of her, or a symptom of her cerebral palsy. She would have seizures. It was like 1 every 4 minutes.
Oof.
And so we needed to make extra foam support behind her neck to reduce shock or moving the device because she didn't shake very much. She would like go still, shake a little bit and then be done.
Mm-hmm.
But it would move the device a little bit when she did that. So we needed to add extra foam to the back. So if you know your audience, you need to know them really well.
Yeah. And I guess also though, but based on the way you've told your story too, you probably at the very beginning thought you knew your audience pretty well, but even then it still took an iterative design.
Yeah.
How often do you get the design 100% right on your first shot?
Yeah, never. I don't think you can do that. That's not how design works. No.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important insight though, is you go in design knowing you're going to have iterative steps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we're not aiming for perfect. We're just aiming for better.
Yeah, and then even better today won't necessarily be better tomorrow, because to our point earlier, the point you made earlier, context will change.
Yeah.
And when context change, that means whatever was better today may need to be adjusted for tomorrow.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And what about physical spaces? Give us the last few recommendations of what people should be thinking about in the physical space.
Yeah, so for physical space, again, is like how you walk into a room. Like, how do you walk into the room?
Yeah.
How do you open the door? What's on the floor? What's on the walls? How do you approach someone in that room? Things like that. Or so like the coffee shop example we did earlier, and then I have this like end goal dream is for me is to make a sensory safe bed and breakfast And I've thought about a lot of things that I would want to have in that kind of space. And so like things like blackout curtains that someone can close if they're overwhelmed. And the room would darken or lighten, and they could choose. Like choice is so important for anybody, but especially people who are differently abled. And then having sensitive skin soap in the bathroom, being like, so it's basically if I were to go into a place and be like, oh, someone thought of me, that's really nice.
Yeah.
Because like I have an allergy, I'm gluten-free, and if I travel anywhere and I'm so excited when there's gluten-free things on the menu and it's like already marked on the menu, I don't have to ask about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh man, someone thought about me and they put it on the menu. If I could design a space like that, that's like the feeling I want someone to have.
That's really, really cool. And so as we kind of wrap things up and summarize in our conversation, let's kind of, and they say kind of in speaking 101, you tell people what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. So let's kind of wrap it up in the sense of, can you summarize for us what in fact accessibility design is, its importance, and, and really where it's used as we kind of wrap things up?
Yeah. So accessible design is serving the needs of any ability level and is including as many ability levels as you can, doing that intentionally. It can be used anywhere. It can be used in all kinds of design, digital design, print design, space design. What was the other question? Sorry, there was
the other question and the benefits of it. And you kind of got to it. And I think the other point I think we want to add to this conclusion is, to the extent that you can, now that, if you've watched this podcast, now that you're aware of the importance of its accessibility design, just with that little bit of awareness, you can start building it in immediately with little to no costs, to your energy and efforts. And, from website design, it's just adding a few extra tags. From a physical environment, it's, maybe having, in a hotel room, the blackout curtains for those people that may need it. Just thinking about some of those things. Now, there may be a cost that you have to consider, or delay implementing things for a time being, but just being aware of it and conscious of it, even in itself, even if you don't necessarily implement everything, based on what I learned from what we talked about, is going to benefit not just those people that specifically need that accommodation, but it will also potentially benefit everyone. Not to mention also create I would suspect a brand reputation lift by over time saying, well, this brand cares. They're considerate of the people that they serve. And I think that would be incrementally beneficial over time for a brand as well.
Yeah, because everyone benefits from something being easier to use, and then every company can benefit from being known as the people who make things easier to use.
Wow, this is just fantastic. So you're graduating soon, and you will be available to any company that wants to be able to reach out to you, or a group that wants to reach out to you and gain access to your services. What's the most appropriate way for them to reach you?
Yeah, so if you'd like to have me consult, I think I'm working on a job offer now, but if you'd like to have me consult for your company, I think the best way to reach me is my email right now is poewe@miamioh.edu, and I'll have that email forwarded to like all my other emails as well, so I can always get reached that way.
And they can always catch you on LinkedIn as well, and we'll put
Yeah.
that link in the comments.
Yeah, of course.
But you are available, and you also mentioned you do speak on this topic too. So if anybody's looking to have an expert like yourself come in and guide them through this discussion and ideas, that would also be an opportunity. No.
Yeah, exactly. I would love to do that.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Well, thank you again. I really am. I've learned a ton myself. I'm going to have to go through and read this all, and then actually go through all my websites as well and say, okay, we got to fix this. But I'm super excited. It was just really great spending time with you, and I'm very grateful for you sharing this time with us.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and spread awareness. It's very, very important to me. So I'm glad I got to talk about it.
Yeah, me too. And we'll be promoting it, and hopefully we'll be getting more people very well aware of this, and also connecting with you to get help from you.
Yeah.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.